the stories you've heard, they don't tell the whole truth. The island is indeed the place of legend. There's power and vast riches as well. But those who've gone before you have simply vanished, never heard from again. I saw the horror, the madness that overcame the crew. It was beyond any evil the world has ever known. How I survived, I do not know. The contents of this box are not of this world. They will guide you to that one, wherever and whatever that may be. Go then, Captain. Chart your course and your fate. I will say a prayer for the souls of your crew.
Come closer. Your captain needs you. There's something wrong. I'm not feeling right. That devil storm. What in the nine hells was that about? And where is my box? I need my box. Did you take it? You bilge rat! Something isn't right. To come so close. It's not fair. What's happening to me? I can't die. Not like this.
only heard of their exploits in service to the Imperium. Their name was well-deserved, he considered. Kendall was silent, like the wind across a grave, and in her passing he noticed that some would shiver without being aware of it, or become distracted for a moment. It was as if the witch-seeker cast an invisible aura around herself that gave mortal men pause. Garrow watched her pass by the entrance to the assembly hall, and his gaze was hooked by the shine of brass and steel upon two grand figures that stood either side of the hatch. Barrel-chested in highly artificed armour, taller than Typhon, the identical sentinels blocked the steel door with crossed battle scythes, the signature weapon of the Death Guard's elite warriors. Only the few personally favoured by the Primarch were permitted to carry such artefacts. They were known as man-reapers, forged in echo of the common farmer's harvesting scythe that it was said Mortarion had fought with in his youth. The first captain wielded one, but Garrow recognised these twin blades immediately. "Death Shroud," he whispered. These two Astartes were the personal honour guards of the Primarch, fated never to reveal their faces to anyone but Mortarion, even to the end of their lives. So it was said, the warriors of the Death Shroud were chosen by the Primarch from the rank-and-file men of the Legion in secret, and then listed as killed in action. They were his nameless guardians, never allowed to venture more than 49 paces from their lord's side. Garrow felt a chill when he realized that he hadn't even been aware that the Death Shroud had entered the chamber. "If they are here, then where is our master?" asked Grulgor. A cold smile of understanding flickered over Typhon's lips. He has been here all along." At the far end of the chamber, a towering shadow detached itself from the dimness beside the oval windows. Steady footsteps brought silence to the room as they crossed the deck plates. With every other footfall there came a heavy metallic report as the base of an iron shaft tapped out the distance. Garrow's muscles tensed as the sound made several of the common naval officers back away from the hololith. In the dusty Terran legends that survived from the histories of nation-states like Merica, Old Ursh, and Oceania, there was the myth of a walker in the darkness who came to claim the freshly dead, a skeletal individual, an incarnation that threshed souls from flesh as keenly as wheat in the fields. These were just stories, though, the speculations of the superstitious and fearful, and yet here and now, a billion light-years from the birthplace of that folklore, the very mirror of that figure rose into the half-light aboard Endurance, tall and gaunt beneath a cloak as grey as sea ice. Mortarion halted and touched the deck plates with the hilt of his man-reaper, the scythe as tall as the Primarch and ahead again. Only the Death Shroud stayed on their feet. Every other person in the room, human or Astartes, was on his knees. Mortarion's cloak parted as he raised his free hand, palm upwards. "Rise," he said. The Primarch's voice was low and firm, at odds with the ashen, hairless face that emerged from the heavy collar surrounding his throat. Wisps of white gas curled from the neck-brace of Mortarion's war gear, captured filters of fumes from the air of Barbarous. Garrow caught the scent of them, and for an instant his sense memory took him back to the grim, clouded planet with its lethal skies. The assemblage came to its feet, and still the Primarch dominated the room. Beneath the grey cloak, he was a knight in shining brass and bare steel. The ornamental skull and star device of the Death Guard grimaced out from his breastplate, and, at his waist, level with the chest of a file Astartes, Garrow saw the drum-shaped holster that carried the lantern, a hand-crafted energy pistol of unique Shenlongi design. Mortarion's only other adornments were a string of globe-shaped sensors in brass. These too contained elements from the poisonous high atmosphere of the Primarch's adoptive home world. Garrow had heard it said that Mortarion would sometimes sample them, like a connoisseur tasting fine wines, or, by turns, pitch them into battle as grenades to send an enemy choking and dying. The battle captain realized he had been holding in his breath, and released it as Mortarion's amber eyes took in the room. Silence fell as his Lord Commander began to speak. Xenos. Pyre Raoul made the word into a curse without effort, drumming his fingers across the stubby barrel of his bolter. I wonder what colour these will bleed. White, purple, green? He glanced around and ran a hand through the close-cut hair on his head. Come, who'll make a wager with me? No one will, Pyre, answered Haker, shaking his head. We're all tired of your trivial gambling. He threw a glance back to the arming pit, where Garrow's housecarl was hard at work. What currency is there to wager between us anyway? Added Voyen, joining Haker at the blade racks. The two veterans were quite unalike in physical aspect. Voyen ample in frame, where Haker was wiry, and yet they were together on most things that affected the squad. We're not swabs or soldiers grubbing over scrip and coinage. Raoul frowned. It's not a game of money, apothecary. Nothing as crude as that. Those things are just a way to keep score. We play for the right to be right. Solon Decius, the youngest member of the command squad, came closer, rubbing a towel over his face to wipe away the sweat from his exertions in the sparring cages. He had a hard look to him that seemed out of place on a youth of his age. His eyes were alight with energy barely held in check, enthused by the sudden possibilities of glory that the arrival of the Primarch had brought. I'll take your wager, if it will quiet you. Decius glanced at Haker and Voyen, but his elders gave him no support. I'll say red, like the orcs. Raoul sniffed. White as milk, like the megarachnid. You are both wrong. From behind Raoul, his face buried in a data slate festooned with tactical maps, Tolan Sendek's flat monotone issued out. The blood of the Yorgul is a dark crimson. The warrior had a heavy brow and hooded eyes that gave him a permanently sleepy expression. And this knowledge is yours, Hal? Demanded Decius. Sendek waved the data slate in the air. I am well read, Solon. While you batter your chainsword's teeth blunt in the cages, I study the foe. These dissection texts of the Magos Biologis are fascinating. Decius snorted. All I need to know is how to kill them. Does your text tell you that, Tolan? Sendek gave a heavy nod. It does. Well, come. Voyen beckoned the Dur Astartes to his feet. Don't keep such information to yourself. Sendek sighed and stood, his perpetually morose features lit by the glow of the data slate's display. He tapped his chest. The Yorgul favour mechanical enhancements to improve their physical form. They have some humanoid traits, a head, neck, eyes, and mouth, but it appears their brains and central nervous systems are situated not here, and he tapped his brow, but here. Tolan's hand lay flat on his chest. To kill would need a heart shot, then? Raoul noted, accepting a nod in return. Ah, said Decius. Like this? In a flash, the Astartes had spun in place and drawn his bolter. A single round exploded from the muzzle and ripped into the torso of a dormant practice dummy, less than a few metres from Garrow's arming pit. The captain's housecarl flinched at the sound of the shot, drawing a tut from Haker. Decius turned away, amused with himself. Merrick Voyen threw Haker a look. Arrogant whelp. I don't understand what the captain sees in him. I once said the same thing about you, Merrick. Speed and skill are nothing without control, the apothecary retorted tersely. Displays like that are better suited to fops like the Emperor's children. The other man's words drew a thin smile from Haker. "We are all Astartes under the skin, brothers and kindred all." Voyan's humour dropped away suddenly. "That, my brother, is as much a lie as it is the truth." In the hololith cube, the shape of the Yorgali construct became visible. It was a fat cylinder, several kilometres long, bulbous at one end with drive clusters, thinning at the other to a stubby prow. Huge, petal-shaped vanes, coated with shimmering panels, emerged from the stern of the thing, catching sunlight and bouncing it through massive windows as big as inland seas. Mortarion gestured with a finger. "A cylinder world. This one has twice the mass of the similar constructs found and eliminated in orbits around the planets Tassak Beta and Phallon. But unlike those, our target is the first Yorgal craft to be found under power in deep space." One of the adepts tickled switches with his worm-like mechadendrites, and the image receded, revealing a halo of teardrop-shaped ships in close formation nearby. "A substantial picket fleet travels ahead of the craft. Captain Temeter will lead the engagement to disrupt these ships and break their lines of communication." The Primarch accepted a salute from Temeter. "Elements of the 1st, 2nd, and 7th Great Companies will stand with me. This battleground is suited to our unique talents. The Yorgal breathe a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen, with heavy concentrations of chlorine, a weak poison that our lungs will resist with little effort." As if to underline the point, Mortarion sniffed at a puff of gas from his half-mask. "First, Captain Typhon will be my support. Commander Grulgor will penetrate the drive cluster and take control of the cylinder's motive power center. Battle Captain Garrow will neutralize the construct's hatcheries." Garrow saluted firmly, mirroring Grulgor and Typhon's gestures. He held off his disappointment at his assigned target, far down the cylinder from the Primarch's attack point, and instead began to consider the first elements of his battle plan. Mortarion hesitated a moment, and Garrow could swear he heard the hint of a smile in the Primarch's voice. "As some of you have deduced, this fight will not be the Death Guards alone. I have, on the request of Malkador the Sigillite, brought a cadre of investigators from the Divisio Astra Telepathica here, led by the Oblivion Night Sister Amendira." The Primarch inclined his head, and Garrow saw the Sister of Silence bow low in return. She gestured in sign language, quick little motions of finger and wrist. "The honoured sisters will join us to seek out a psycha trace that has led to this bottle world." Garrow stiffened. Psychas? This was the first he had heard of such a threat on the Yorgali ship, and he noted that only Typhon did not seem surprised at such news. "I trust that the full importance of this endeavour is impressed upon each of you," continued the Death Lord, his low tone strong. "These Yorgal repeatedly enter our space in their generation ships, intent on spawning over worlds that belong to the Emperor. They must not be allowed to gain a foothold." He turned away, his face disappearing into his cloak. "In time, the Astartes will erase these creatures from humanity's skies, and today will be a step along that path." Garrow and his battle brothers saluted once more, as Mortarion turned his back on them and moved away towards the welcoming shadows. They did not chorus in a battle cry, or mark the moment with raised pronouncements. The Primarch had spoken, and his was voice enough. Chapter 2. The thrust of the heavy assault boat's engines was a hammer to their bones, pressing the Astartes into the acceleration racks. Garrow held his muscles tense against the powerful G-forces and let his gaze wander over the interior of the clamshell doors that formed the bow of the boarding ship. Intricate scrollwork spread across the inner face of the doors, charting the countless actions the craft had been involved in. It was one of hundreds hurtling through the void at this moment, packed with men primed for war, each of them targeted on the Yorgul world ship with the unerring single-mindedness of a guided missile. Through the picked circuits laced into the lenses of his armor, Garrow rapidly blink-clicked through the data available to him via his command-level VoxNet. There were feeds from the eye cameras of the squad leaders, quick scripts of telemetry from Voyen's Medicae Auspex, and there, for a moment, a grainy low-resolution image from outside across the boat's serrated prow. Garrow dallied on that for a few seconds, watching the motion of the vast cylinder as they approached it. The hull wall of pearlescent metal grew larger. It was so huge that the curvature of it was hardly noticeable, and the only sign that they were actually closing on it was the slow crawl of detail as surface features became clearer. Here a cluster of spikes that might be antennae, there a bulbous turret spitting yellow tracer fire. The captain felt no fear at the Yorgul guns. The assault was moving at punishing speed beneath a cloak of electronic countermeasures. Heat baffled flare bursts and glittering clouds of metal chaff that would render sensors unintelligible. He was confident in Temeta's skills, certain that the captain of the Fourth had sent the picket fleet into disarray and robbed the Xenos of any usable warning. The wall was very close, the distance vanishing in moments. Garrow was aware of other boats converging at the edges of the greyed-out image. Long-range sensors had determined that this portion of the cylinder's hull was thin, and so it would be here, some half a kilometre from the cylinder's midline, that the Death Guard would make their ingress. Garrow let the link fade and gathered himself, switching over to the General Vox channel. His voice echoed in the helms of every Astartes on the boat. "Steel in your bones, brothers. Impact is imminent. I want a clean and fast deployment. I want it so sharp the Emperor himself would applaud its perfection." He took a breath as the standby alert began to wail. "Today, the Primarch leads us, and we will make him proud to do so. For Mortarion and Terra! Mortarion and Terra!" Garrow heard Haker's rough baritone through the chorus of assent. Decius's voice cut across the channel, brimming with zeal. "Count the 7!" he cried, yelling out the company's call to rally. "Count the 7!" Garrow joined in, but his words were abruptly shaken out of him as the assault boat's thick bow rammed into the hull of the Yorgul cylinder. Piercing shrieks of rendered metal and escaping atmosphere thundered around the boat's thick fuselage as it drove itself deep, clawed tracks across its flanks, biting and sparking to pull it through meters of chitinous armor plate. Turning and shifting, the boat's autonomic pilot brain deployed hydraulic barbs to stop the outgassing of air from blowing them back into the void. The juddering, screeching, ear-splitting ride seemed to go on forever. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The assault ship listed. Garrow heard metal scrape on metal, and then the trigger rune before him on the clamshell hatch flashed on. "Ready on release!" he snapped. The hatch blew open on explosive bolts, and Garrow had his bolter loose and in his hands, ready to kill anything that dared to come in. But it was a sudden flood of brackish blue water that smashed down into the boat, not an enemy defender. The liquid was icy, swirling rapidly around his legs and up to his stomach. "Go!" Garrow roared. The battle captain was aware of his men moving behind him as he launched himself out of the assault craft. He plunged into the cobalt murk and burst back through the surface, turning around, getting his bearings. It was 100-to-1 chance. The assault had penetrated through the bottom of a shallow chemical lake, and the dark hulls of the boats protruded from the sluggish liquid like the tips of jagged armoured fingers. Already the waters were icing over and freezing into blue-white halos where the cold kiss of space had followed the invaders in. Through his helmet's breath screen, Garrow drew a rough inhalation that tasted of metallic salts. Nearby, he saw Grulgor kick angrily away from his lander and snarl out a command. There, on the shore, pointing with his man-reaper, was Mortarion. The sight of the Primarch was enough to send Garrow's blood racing, and he stormed forward through the shallows, his bolter held high. "Count the 7!" called the captain, and he did not need to look behind him to see the elements of his company follow in formation. Garrow advanced from the deployment point, with Haker's veteran squad at his side, joined by Decius and Sendek for support. Around them, the chaotic crash of gunfire and blades on blades rippled over the gentle landscape of the lakeshore. Hordes of Astartes met the Xenos in deadly, furious conflict. The alien force was quickly in disarray. Even in non-humans, Garrow could sense the motion and shift in the character of a battalion when they lost their nerve. Groups broke apart and reformed, milling and confused, instead of drawing out and away in any semblance of order. Butchering them would not take too much of the Death Guard's energy. It was clear the Yorgali had understood too late that the objects on a course towards their world ship were not massive munitions, but actually manned craft. The near-suicidal manner of such a boarding operation had shocked them, and they were unprepared for the brutal fury of the Death Guard incursion. Their mistake had been compounded by errors in the deployment of their competent enhanciles. The Yorgal cyborgs standing on the banks of the chlorine lagoon were massacred, their keening cries echoing over the shallow sandy dunes surrounding the landing zone. In the back of his mind, the battle captain was already thinking ahead, considering how they would secure the breach point before the companies split to attend their individual objectives. Garrow led his men in a thrust through a nest of spindly, whirling dervishes, fighting past sweeps of dull steel glaives and placing double-tap bolt shots through the ribs of every Yorgal they saw. The Astartes expanded outward from the lake in a ring of off-white armour, the advance rolling over the defenders. Moving and firing, Garrow's troop crested a dune of crystalline granules that crunched loudly beneath their boots and found some close combat kills. A phalanx of Yorgals swept and turned to them, caught in mid-flight, daring to stop and engage the Astartes. Weapons barked on both sides of the fight, the heavy roar of bolters drowning out the hissing clatter of electrostatic arc fire from the implanted projectors of the enemy. Decius, who favoured the blunt trauma of a power fist, slipped into the midst of the aliens and punched one to the powdery dirt, over and over, slamming its long neck and oval head into a ruin. "Has he forgotten what I said already? I told him to aim for the torso for a quick kill," said Sendek. "He hasn't forgotten," said Haker. With a peculiar, ululating cry, two of the larger Xenos coiled and leapt directly at Garrow. In mid-jump, they came open, like spreading petals on a flower, their tri-fold legs and arms wide. He saw glitters where whole portions of limbs had been replaced with dull metal and black curves of carbon. In one swift motion, the captain let his bolter drop away on its sling and drew Libertas, a blue glow of power shimmering across the blade. In a wide, double-handed sweep, Garrow cut both the creatures in half, the sword whispering easily through their scaly tissue. Haker grunted his approval. "Still sharp, then?" "Aye," Garrow replied, shaking droplets of deep red from the blade. He paused momentarily to examine his work, viewing the severed limbs with the same dispassion he had the static intelligence images on Sendek's data slate. In their natural, fully fleshed state, a Yorgali adult was perhaps 4.5 meters tall, moving on 3 legs with 3 joints that radiated from their lower torsos like the spokes on a wheel. Apart from the extensile neck, the upper body of the aliens resembled the lower, but here the 3 limbs ended in hands with 6 digits. The egg-shaped head had deep-set, roomy eyes and fleshy notches for a nose and mouth. They had skin like Terran lizards, all scales and tiny horns of bone. However, there seemed to be no such thing as a natural Yorgal. Every single example of the Xenos species yet encountered and terminated by servants of the Imperium, from immature cubs to infirm elders, was modified with implanted devices or cybernetic proxy mechanisms. The slate showed oddities, such as spring piston legs, feet replaced with wheels and rollers, knife claws, sheets of subdermal armor plating, telecameras inside optic cavities, and even ballistic needler weapons nestled within the hollows of bones. The similarity in intent between the alien implants and the engineered organs that he possessed as an Astartes was not lost on Garrow. But these were Xenos, and they were invaders. They were nothing like him, and, as the Emperor had decreed, they were to be chastised for daring to venture into human space. Near to the sluggish waterline, a horde of clawed Yorgali, most likely some kind of hand-to-hand variant, hacked at a dreadnought from the Second Company. The venerable warrior had become bogged down in the chemical slurry at the lake's edge, and Garrow saw it spin on its torso axis, clubbing at them with a chain fist. A white flash fell from nowhere into the heart of the Yorgal Rippers, and the captain heard Ignatius Grulgor bellow with wild laughter. Grulgor came to his feet, surrounded by the Xenos, and threw back his head. The commander of the second had gone barefaced. The foul air of the bottle world did not concern him. In either hand he carried a regulation Mars-pattern bolter, and, with delight, Grulgor unloaded them at point-blank range into the enemy. The sheer velocity of the shots chopped the Yorgal into reeking gobbets of flesh, giving the dreadnought valuable seconds in which to extract itself. In moments, Grulgor stood at the centre of a circle of alien carcasses, vapour coiling from the barrels of his guns. The commander saluted the Primarch and flashed a sly, daring grin at Garrow before moving on in search of new targets. "He's so artless, don't you think?" murmured Haker. "The esteemed Huron Fowl would have fought his own way out of that mess, but Grulgor wades in, more concerned about showing his mettle to the Primarch than where best to spend his ammunition." "We're Death Guard. We're not supposed to be artists," Garrow retorted. "We are craftsmen in war, nothing more, direct and brutal. We don't seek accolades and honours, only duty." "Of course," said the veteran mildly. Decius came bounding up to Garrow, kicking away the corpse parts from his kill. "Ugh! Do you smell that, sir? These things, their blood stinks." The battle captain didn't answer. He hesitated, his attention drifting, watching Mortarion in the thick of his cold fury. At the Primarch's side, Typhon and the twin sentinels of the Death Shroud were whirling and culling, their man-reapers moving unhindered through a milling, screaming pack of Yorgal. The Death Lord himself had clearly deemed these inferior strains of Xenos to be unworthy of his scythe, and instead was at work putting them to the light of his lantern. Hard-edged white rays keened from the stub barrel of the huge brass pistol, leaving purple after-images on Garrow's retina, despite the enhancements of his modified eyesight. Wherever the lantern's punishing beam struck, Yorgal defenders became charcoal sketches, twisting, then turning to smoke. Mortarion reached into a hooting scrum of aliens and ripped an injured man from their midst, batting them effortlessly away as he hauled the wounded Death Guard to safety. The Primarch spared the man some unheard words, and in return the bare-headed Astartes roared in assent, rejoining the fight. "Magnificent!" breathed Decius, and Garrow could sense the coiled need in the younger man, the yearning to run down the dune and press into Mortarion's company, to throw away all battlefield protocol just for the chance to fight within his master's aura. It was a difficult urge to resist. Garrow felt it just as strongly, but he would not lower himself to duplicate the self-aggrandizing behaviour of men like Grulgor. Then the younger Astartes tore his gaze away and cast around. "So, this is the great creation of the Xenos, eh? Not much to look at. Human spacefarers once lived in cylinders such as this, noted Sendek as he reloaded. In the deep past, before we mastered the force of gravity, they called them Onil colonies. Decius seemed unimpressed. I feel like a fly, trapped in a bottle. What sort of inside-out world is this? He gestured upward, to where the landscape curved away to meet itself kilometres over their heads. A thin bar of illuminators extended away down the axis of the cylinder, disappearing to the fore and aft in yellow clouds. Garrow's eyes narrowed as he spied motes of dark green moving up there, shifting through the corridor of zero gravity at the world ship's centre. Haker tensed at his side. I see them too, Battle Captain. Airborne reinforcements. Garrow called out on the General Vox channel. Look to the skies, Death Guard! On the blood-slicked sandbanks, Mortarion stabbed at the air with the blade of his scythe. The captain of the 7th has keen vision. The Xenos seek to distract us with easy kills, to keep our attention on the ground. The Primarch gave Garrow a curt nod, and strode to the top of another shallow powder dune, ignoring the scatters of enemy needle-shot that whined off his brass armour. Mortarion let his hood roll back so he could turn his face to the caged sky. We must correct them. For a long second, Nathaniel found himself rooted to the spot by his master's casual acknowledgment, despite his best intention to make little of it. The favour of his Primarch, of an Emperor's son, even for an instant, was a heady thing indeed, and he found some understanding as to why men like Grulgor would go so far to court it. Then Garrow shook it off, and slammed a fresh sickle magazine into his weapon. 7th to arms! He cried, bringing the bolter to his shoulder and sighting upward along its length. The Yorgul flyers came in numbers that dwarfed the ragged packs of land-based fighters the Death Guard met at the lake. Clad in a flickering green armour that wound about them in strips, the airborne Xenos had sacrificed 2 of their limbs to their mechanical surgeons. In their stead were beating wings of sharp metal feathers, each edged like a razor. Feet had become balls of curved talons, and there were more of the lethal arc throwers and needle guns embedded in joints where they had keen fields of fire. They came down whistling and hooting, met a wall of bolt shell and high-energy plasma, and died. But this was only the first wave, and more of them, green glitters in the sky, poured out of the gauzy yellow cloud. Garrow saw one of Haker's men wreathed in humming glints of artificial lightning, and smelled the stench of crisping human meat as a flight of the Xenos flyers shocked the life from him. Nearby, the dreadnought, Huron Fowl, deployed his missile packs, and threw explosive death into the wheeling flocks, blasting dozens of them out of the air with the concussion. For his part, Garrow moved carefully, low to the oxide sands, picking off the Xenos in bursts of full auto-fire as they dropped in on swooping strikes. The attack pattern of the aliens was clear. They were attempting to push the Astartes back into the icy lake. "Not today," said the battle captain to the air, clipping the wings of a large adult female. The creature spiralled headfirst into the sands and twitched. He became aware that he had company. Garrow glanced over his shoulder and frowned in mild surprise at the cadre of lithe golden figures coming up behind him. The Sisters of Silence moved in quick lockstep, maintaining coherent fire corridors and combat discipline with an efficiency that he had only previously seen among his brother Astartes. It was difficult for him to tell the women apart. Their armour was polished to a glittering sheen, unadorned by any brash sigils or fluttering oath papers like the pale war gear of the Death Guard. Their faces were hidden behind hawkish gold helmets that reminded him of the barred gates to some ancient citadel, no doubt equipped with breather gear that let the unmodified sisterhood manage the toxic air of the bottle world. They seemed identical, as if they were forged from some mythic mould by the Emperor's hand. He wondered idly if normal men might view the Astartes in a similar way. The sisterhood carried swords and flamers. Blades and plumes of fire licked at the Yorgul flyers as they dipped into range. Some also carried bolters. As was their vow in the Emperor's service, the women never spoke, even those speared by needle rounds or struck by arc fire. They communicated in line of sight using a gestural language similar to Astartes' battle sign, all through a code of clicks over the vox. From the way they crossed the engagement zone, he had no doubt in his mind that they knew exactly where they were going. As they passed, the sister closest to him spared Garrow a look, and the battle captain felt a peculiar chill fall across him. That the sisterhood ranged the galaxy in search of rogue psychics to capture or expunge was widely known, but what was less understood was the manner in which they did it. Garrow had heard that, unlike other living beings, these unspeaking women were silent not just in the material world, but also in the ephemeral realm of the mind. There were names for them: untouchables, pariahs, blanks. He frowned at the irrational nature of thoughts, pushing them away. In the next second they were forgotten, as warning runes blinked inside his visor. Garrow caught the sound of shrieking air over razor wings. He moved as a flight of Yorgali came down upon them. Fast as only an Astartes could be, he slammed his hand into the back of the sister at his flank and sent her down and away as tenfold claws cut through the air towards them. Garrow threw his arm up to deflect the blow and felt the talons slice gouges through his vambrace. The screeching Yorgul ripped upwards and into his helmet, tearing it from his neck ring in a bone-wrenching impact. He staggered and recovered, bringing his bolter to bear. Garrow's gun barked, and from the sand the sister fired with him. None of the flight that had dared to attack them lived to take air again. The battle captain grimaced and patted his face, content to find he had gained no new scars from the encounter. Getting to her feet, the Witch-Seeker walked to him and presented Garrow with his helmet, ripped back from the Yorgul claws. It was badly damaged, but the symbolic gesture was an important one. The woman looked up and inclined her head. With her free hand she touched her heart and her brow. The meaning was clear. My thanks to you. Unsure of the correct protocol, Garrow simply nodded in return, and that seemed enough. The women moved on, leaving him behind. It was only as he saw their backs that Garrow noticed the plume of dark hair issuing from the sister's golden helm, and the red aquila etching across her shoulder blades. He moved down to the core of the fighting, over a dunescape littered with Yorgul dead, and, on rare occasions, fallen figures in pale grey power armour. Each brother perished here ground Garrow's rage like stone on stone. For every one of them was worth 1,000 of the freakish intruders. The captain heard the slamming crack of Mortarian's lantern once again, and looked up to see the Primarch sweep it through the air like a searchlight, catching aliens afire, turning them into a rain of ashen fallout. Typhon's harsh growls sounded on the General Vox channel. "Well, if this is all we have to face, I question if our might will even be tested today. My father sent me here." Mortarian's words were mild, but heavy with intent. "Do you think him wrong to do so, First Captain?" Another man might have balked at the veiled threat, but not Typhon. "I only chafe at such poor sport, Lord Commander. We dally here too long, sir." Garrow caught a grunt of agreement. "Perhaps we do, my friend." When he spoke again, the Primarch did it aloud, eschewing the Vox to broadcast his voice. "Sons of Death, you know your objectives. Take your units and prosecute the foe. Typhon, with me. Grulgor, the drives. Garrow, the hatchery. Go now." The elements of the 7th Company came to him, and the battle captain was pleased to see that there had been few losses among them. The apothecary, Voyen, looked him up and down, silently commenting on the state of his helmet, where the headgear hung from his belt. Decius, too, was unhooded, and his pale face was split with a murderous grin. The staining of viscera on his power fist was mute testament to his kills so far. He nodded to them, and the men of the 7th took up their formation. They moved, letting Grulgor's company mop up the last of the airborne Yorgul. They crossed out from the crystalline dunes at a quick pace, and into groves of tall tree-like forms, woven from some kind of rough fibre. Sendek ministered to his auspex. "Tactical plot shows heat sources comparable to Yorgul hatchery constructs in this direction," he pointed. "That way. The virtual compass is having difficulty assimilating the internal structure of the bottle world." "How current is that data?" asked Haker. "The sense servitors neglected to tell us we were landing in a chem lake. I find myself wondering what else they may have missed." Sendek frowned. "The readings are contradictory." "Best we be ready for surprises, then," noted Raoul, hefting the combi bolter in his grip. "Do not allow yourself to be lulled into complacency by the name of your target, Captain." Mortarion had spoken the words without looking at him, as Garrow stared into the hololith in Endurance's assembly hall. "This so-called hatchery is not only the creche for the Yorgali young, but also a place of modification. You will probably find eggs filled with armed adults, as well as their larvae." Garrow recalled the Primarch's words as he looked up at the towering fibrous trees. Further into the forest, where the stalks were planted in dense regular rows, the tree things were heavy with great grey orbs that hung like monstrous fruits. Some showed signs of motion inside, things shifting about in lazy thrashes. Here and there were pools of watery fluid that Sendek immediately designated as yolk. Voyen agreed with the description, pointing out dripping orbs up above that hung ragged, formless and clearly empty. "The roots of the trees drink the liquid back into the system," noted Sendek. "Quite efficient." "I'm rapt with fascination," Raoul said, in a tone that indicated the reverse. Decius kept his bolter close. "Where are the defences? Do these Xenos care so little about their spawn that they leave them open to any predator that happens by?" "Perhaps their children are the predators," offered Haker darkly. One of the men from the veteran squad halted and gestured ahead. "Captain," he asked, "do you see this?" "What is it?" asked Garrow. The Astartes bent and gathered up a shiny metallic object, roughly oval in shape. He turned it over in his hands. It's a helm, I think." He held it up to show them, and Garrow's blood chilled at the sight of a Silent Sister's war gear. Something shifted inside it, and a severed head dropped from the helmet to the ground, trailing a plume of blonde hair. "Clean cut," noted the Astartes. "Very fresh." Voyen's eyes narrowed. "Where's the rest of her?" Decius used his bolter to point towards different branches of the trees. "Here, there, and there. Oh, over there as well, I think." Wet rags of red and gold were visible on each. "The sisters came to the hatchery?" Haker cast around, looking low. "Why would witch seekers come here?" Decius gave a dry chuckle. "That, old man, would seem to be secondary to the question of what it was that killed her." From ahead of them, where the trunks were thickest, there came a ripple of bolter fire. Garrow spied the glitter of sporadic muzzle flashes, even as a low rumble spread through the sandy dirt beneath his boots. Cracking sounds, sharp as snapping bone, reached him as trees in the middle distance shook and bent, the tops of them fluttering and falling as something large knocked them down. "You're about to get your answer," Raoul said, raising his bolter. The sisterhood came through the egg trees, moving like dancers, harrying the Yorgali enhancile with their weapons. It was the largest of the Xenos that Garrow had encountered on board the Bottle World, and of a design that had not been in Sendek's documentation. Outwardly, it resembled the form of a Yorgul in a basic sense, but it was perhaps 10 times their mass. As high as the canopy of the trees, the thing appeared to be an agglomeration of scaled flesh and metals, a Yorgul deformed by gigantism, and then improved by technology to be larger still. The battle captain could make out fleshy matter inside a glass orb at the middle of the cyborg's mass. Perhaps, he reasoned, whatever remained of the Yorgul's original form. It had no arms. Instead, there were writhing clusters of grey iron tentacles sprouting from each of its upper limb sockets. Some moved like striking serpents, snapping out at the sisters, while others knotted around an unseen burden that the thing clasped desperately to its chest. "Some sort of guardian?" offered Voyen. "Some sort of target!" retorted Decius, and opened fire. The Death Guard moved in to assist the Sisterhood, firing on the approach, adding their shots to the storm of bullets that haloed the cyborg. Garrow had the fleeting impression that the machine form was trying to escape, but then it turned around and threw any notion of fleeing aside. Perhaps it might have got away from the women, but with Garrow's arrival it had no other choice but to stand and fight. Metal feelers lashed out across the ground, keen-edged tips slicing furrows in the dirt. They flexed and moved, ripping up divots and roots. Haker was caught off guard as a tentacle lashed at him and threw the Astartes aside, rolling off the trunk of an egg tree. Garrow saw another rip the leg from one of the troopers and put him down in a welter of blood. The captain ducked away from the questing appendages as they hissed over his head. A witch-seeker, caught with her bolter breech open and magazine empty, met the tip of them through her breastbone. They stabbed through her torso and pinned her to a tree, then tore back out in a jet of spent vitae. Still trailing blood, the tentacles bent and whipped at the Emperor's warriors, clipping Rahl on the backswing and tearing the gold hood from another of Kendall's women. Without her helmet, a severe null maiden with a red topknot and portcullis faceplate choked and stumbled, the rancid atmosphere of the Yorgul vessel scouring her lungs. Voyen was already moving to assist her, and Garrow's face soured. The cyborg was just too fast, too wild and uncontrolled in its motions. To kill it, they would need to take a more direct approach. He thumbed the selector switch on his bolter to fully automatic fire and charged the Xenos hybrid. The battle captain unloaded an entire clip into the legs and thorax of the cyborg, gouts of oily fluid and flashing short-circuit arcs marking where each round hit home. The Yorgul thing hooted and growled, turning to focus its attention on the figure in grey-white armour. Steel-sheathed whips shot out, extending and buzzing with effort, and Garrow threw himself into a roll, dodging the places where they stabbed into the soil. The tips of the lashing feelers clattered over his ceramite armour, and Garrow felt a sting of pain as they raked the place where the flyer's claws had cut him on the lakeside, reopening the wounds there. A chance flexion of the tentacle, a second of delay on his part, and suddenly the captain's bolter was spinning away from him through the air, the strap hanging ragged as the gun was snapped from his grip. Garrow turned into the force of the impact, rolled again and came up with Libertas in his hand. Stabbing lines of metal came at him, and he batted them away with the sword blade. Flares of sparks glaring orange-white in the sullen artificial daylight of the egg tree groves. The others were pouring their fire onto the cyborg, but its attention was still split between Garrow and the object it held tight, something swaddled in thin grey muslin. The battle captain threw himself at the Yorgul mechanoid, chopping off the tips of tentacles and slashing at others. He spun as he felt iron limbs touch his legs and hacked at them, but he was close to its torso, and the cyborg's appendages were thicker here, more muscular, more resilient. Powerful coils enveloped him, and Garrow felt the ground drop away. The machine hybrid shook him violently, his sword arm flailing against his side where he could not turn Libertas in his defence. His teeth rattled inside his skull, and there was blood in his mouth. He heard the splintering of flex steel in the joints of his armour, smelled the acidic tang of spilled coolant as leaks jetted from his backpack. The Astartes hissed through his teeth as pain bit into him, compacting his implanted carapace and ribcage. It was a struggle to keep breath in his lungs, as the pressure grew greater with every moment. Garrow was aware of motion as the cyborg drew him closer, up to the glassy capsule of its meat core. Hollow, predatory eyes stared at him, brimming with alien hate. The Yorgul wanted to watch him die, to savour it. The killing stress continued to increase as Garrow's 3 lungs ran dry, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. Darkness was closing in on him. At the edges of the captain's consciousness, he glimpsed a shimmering ghost image, a figure that seemed to be his Primarch, beckoning him towards oblivion. In that moment, Garrow tapped a final reserve of mad, desperate strength. "By Terra's will," he told himself, "in the name of my homeworld and of the Imperium of Man, I will not perish." New energy flooded through him, hot and raw. Garrow reached deep into himself and found a wellspring of conviction, steeling himself against the Xenos' murderous embrace. The captain felt warmth spread into his agonized muscles as he pictured Terra's majesty in his mind's eye, and there, with his hand cupped beneath it, holding it safe, the Emperor. "In the Emperor's name, I will not fail. I dare not fail." He unleashed a wordless, furious snarl of defiance and fought back against the alien coils, putting every last ounce of power he could muster into Libertas. The power sword's blade met Yorgul's steel and parted it, screeching through artificial nerves and mechanical cabling. The cyborg faltered and stumbled as Garrow cut his way free, fragments of cracked ceramite shedding from his armour. The captain's burning lungs drank in ragged gulps of air. He pressed forward, even as the machine form tried to shove him away, bringing up the glowing tip of the blade. Garrow saw emotion flutter over the trembling mouthparts of the Yorgul as Libertas touched the crown of its glass pod. Unlike the Xenos, the captain did not linger for the sake of cruelty. Instead, he pressed his entire weight behind the sword and shattered the capsule, forcing the weapon into the fleshy torso of the alien until it burst from the cyborg's back in a rain of crimson. The Yorgul collapsed with a thunderous crash, tearing down a stand of trees as it fell. Half-finished things erupted from eggs, mewling and spitting, to be met by the guns of the Death Guard and the Witch-Seekers. Taking back his sword, Garrow dropped to the ground as the cyborg's last nerve impulses fluttered through its limbs. Its burden, the shape in grey muslin, was released and rolled to his feet. The captain knelt and unwrapped it with the tip of his blade. Inside, there was an immature Yorgul. What surprised him was not that the Xenos hatchling was completely free of any mechanical augmentation, but the freakish mutation of the tripedal being. It was conjoined, a malformation of 2 aliens that had somehow become merged during growth. Its skull was enormous, a bloated thing with 4 distinct chambers, quite unlike the ovoid heads typical of its species. Legs and arms twitched towards him, milky eyes swiveled and narrowed in Garrow's direction. Without warning, the air around him changed. The atmosphere became greasy and slick on his skin, suddenly scratchy with the sharp stench of ozone. He had felt such things before, on other battlefields, in other wars for the good of humanity. Garrow's mind screamed a single word, and he understood exactly why the Sisters of Silence had come to this place. Psyker. He drew up the sword in an arc, ready to take the creature's head from its shoulders. "Wait!" The word struck him like a cold flood, making his arm go rigid. The ozone stink enveloped him, clouding his thoughts and tightening on his mind just as the cyborg had coiled around his body. It reached into Garrow, searching through him as easily as he might have leafed through a book. "Death Guard," it whispered, amusement in its words. "So confident of your rightness, so afraid to see the crack in your spirit." Garrow tried to complete the killing blow, but he was locked tight, trapped in amber.
Soon the end comes. We see tomorrow. So shall you. All you worship will wither. All will...
The mutant's torso burst in a welter of blood and bone fragments, as a single bolter round tore a hole through it as big as a fist. Suddenly, the haze was gone, and Garrow blinked it away, as if waking from a deep sleep. He turned and found Sister Amandira Kendall at his shoulder, smoke curling from the muzzle of her gun. Her dark eyes studied him from the vision slits of her helmet. The captain stood carefully and duplicated her gesture from the lakeside, touching his armoured fingertips to his heart and his brow. He became aware of a sound reaching through the wooded ranks of the hatchery, a whistling, a keening that was quickly growing in volume. The sound was atonal and harsh on his ears. It was a lament, a cry from the unhatched.
"Look!"
shouted Haker.
"In the trees! Movement everywhere!"
Every egg orb that Garrow could see was trembling as the Yorgali things inside thrashed and tore at their confinement, frantic in their need to escape. He flicked a look to Kendall, as the sister directed her cohorts to gather the dead mutant into a chainmail sack. She glanced up at him and nodded. Perhaps Voyan had been correct. Perhaps the cyborg had been some kind of guardian protecting the Psyker child. And now it was dead, its siblings were enraged. Spatters of yolk rained down from the trunks. Kendall flicked out harsh gestures to her sisters, and the women moved off, turning their flamers on the foliage. Garrow saw the merit in her action, and called into his Vox link, "Deploy grenades and explosives! Follow the Sisterhood's example! Destroy the trees!" The fibrous matter of the egg trees was dry and made excellent tinder. In moments, the alien woodland was burning, the grey sacks popping and boiling. Many of the enhansiles made it to the ground, mad with fury, and they were put down with detached precision. Garrow watched the blue-tinged flames sear and dance as they spread, murdering the world ships dormant and newborn. All across the bottle, the Yorgal were perishing beneath the hand of the Death Guard, making a lie of the mutant child's final words.
"A lie,"
said Garrow aloud, watching the poisonous smoke turn above his head. Chapter 3. In the ruins of their enemy, the Death Guard task force regrouped and surveyed the breadth of the destruction they had wrought. The wreckage of the Yorgali picket fleet was a cloud of crystallized breathing gases, hull fragments, and the dead. Some of the teardrop-shaped Xenos vessels were still relatively intact. One by one, these were being scuttled with atomic charges, reduced to sun-hot balls of radioactive plasma. In less than a standard Terran day, there would be nothing recognizable left to show the face of an enemy that the Death Guard had obliterated so utterly. Out there, in the shoal of destruction, stormbirds on funerary details scoured the engagement area for Astartes who had been blown into the dark during boarding operations. Those found would be interred as heroes, once the progenoid glands in their corpses had been harvested. The precious flesh matter from the dead would serve the Legion in their stead, passing on to strengthen new initiates when the next round of recruitment began. Once in a while, a lucky find would bring the recovery crews a live battle brother, dormant inside his armour beneath the lulling pressure of his sus-an membranes. But that happened very rarely. Beyond the zone where the Death Guard fleet gathered like carrion birds around a corpse, the Yorgal bottle was executing a slow, wounded turn to sight down into the ecliptic plane of the Iota Horologi system. Drifts of wreckage and broken panels from the construct's vast solar panels floated behind it in a faint cometary tail. The main drives blinked out of sequence as the fusion motors worked the colossal mass of the world ship about. Dissenting voices from the Mechanicum contingent aboard the warship Spectre of Death had petitioned Mortarion for a few days in which to loot the alien craft of technology. The Primarch, as was his prerogative, refused the request. The letter of Lord Malcador's orders, and therefore by extension those of the Emperor himself, was that the Yorgul incursion into the sector was to be exterminated. The master of the Death Guard clearly saw no point of confusion in those orders. There was to be nothing left of the aliens. And yet Nathaniel Garrow watched the play and turn of the fleet from the gallery above the Endurance's main launch bay. Above him, a span of thick armoured glass and space beyond it. Below, through skeletal brass frames and grid-cut decking, the expanse of the flight platform. Gradually his gaze dropped. Down among the sleek stormbirds and heavy thunderhawks was a single swan-like shuttlecraft, the spread wings of the ship detailed in gold and black. It stood out among the white and grey Astartes craft, a single bright game fowl nestled in a flock of pale raptors. Aboard that vessel, a sole tangible remnant of the assault would remain after all the works of the Yorgul were erased from this sector of space. He found himself wondering what other orders the Sisters of Silence had, orders that were unbound, even in the face of a Primarch's countermand. It was not defiance on their part to go against Mortarion's wishes, if it was the Emperor's will to do otherwise, surely. This was not disobedience. This was a trivial issue, a small thing of little consequence. Garrow had never known of and could barely envisage an instance when the commands of Primarch and Emperor would not be in harmony. An oiled hiss signalled the opening of the gallery's hatch, and Garrow looked to see who had come to interrupt his customary moment of solitude after the battle. A small smile curled at his lips as two figures entered the echoing, empty colonnade. He gave a shallow bow as Amandira Kendall approached him, a younger woman in a less ornate version of a witch-seeker's robes walking at her heels. Kendall looked to Garrow as he assumed he must have looked to her, fresh from the battlefield, fatigued but content that the fight had gone well.
"Sister," said Garrow, "I trust the outcome this day was satisfactory to you."
The woman signed a few words, and the girl at her side spoke.
"Battle Captain Garrow, well met. The goals of the Imperium have been ably served."
Nathaniel raised an eyebrow and looked directly at the girl. He saw her more clearly now, noting that she had no armour or visible weapons, as Kendall did.
"Forgive me, but it was my understanding that the Sisters of Silence are never to speak."
The girl nodded, her manner changing slightly as she answered.
"That is indeed so, Lord. No sister may utter a word unto death, once she gives the oath of tranquillity. I am a novice, Captain. I have yet to take the vow, and so I may speak to you. Sisters-in-waiting, such as I, serve our order when communication is needed with outsiders." "Indeed." Garrow nodded. "Then may I ask your mistress what she wishes of me?"
Kendall gestured again, and the novice translated, her voice taking on a formal tone once more.
"I wish to speak with you before we departed the Endurance, on the matters to which you and your men were party aboard the Yorgul cylinder. It is the Emperor's wish that they not be spoken of."
The captain absorbed this. Of course, why else had Kendall killed the alien psyker with a shot to the chest instead of a round through the skull? To preserve whatever secrets it held inside that misshapen head. He nodded to himself. The Lord of Man's great works into the understanding of the ethereal realms were beyond his grasp as a mere captain, and if the Emperor required the corpse of a dead Xenos mutant to further that understanding, then Nathaniel Garrow had no place to contradict it.
"I shall make it so. The Emperor has his tasks, and we have ours. My men would never question that."
The silent sister came a little closer and watched him carefully. She signed something to the novice, and the girl hesitated, questioning her mistress in return before relaying the words.
Sister Amandira asks... She wishes to know if the child spoke to you.
It had no mouth, Garrow answered, quicker than he intended to. Kendall placed a finger on her lips and shook her head. Then she moved the finger to her temple. Nathaniel looked at his hands. There were still flecks of alien blood on them. "I am clean of any taint," he insisted. "The thing did not contaminate me."
"Did it speak to you?" repeated the novice.
The moment became long before he spoke. "It knew what I was. It said it could see tomorrow. It told me all I worship would die." Garrow sneered. "But I am an Astartes. I worship nothing. I honor no false god, only the reality of imperial truth." His answer seemed to appease Sister Amandira, and she inclined her head in a bow.
"Your fealty, like that of all Death Guard, has never been in doubt, Captain. Thank you for your honesty," relayed the novice. "It is clear the creature was attempting to cloud your intention. You did well to resist it."
The Oblivion Knight made the sign of the Aquila and bowed. The girl mirrored Kendall's gesture.
"My mistress wishes you and your company to accept the commendation and gratitude of the Sisters of Silence. Your names will be presented to the Sigillite in recognition of your service to Terra."
"You honor us," Garrow replied. "If I might ask, what was the fate of your comrade, the Null Maiden who was unhooded in the fighting?"
The novice nodded. Sister Thessaly, yes. Her injuries were serious, but she will recover. Our Medicae aboard the Area Gloris will heal her in due course. I understand your brother Voyen saved her life."
"Area Gloris," repeated Garrow. "I do not know of that vessel. Is it part of our flotilla?" A smile crossed Kendall's lips, and she signed to the novice.
"No, Captain. It is part of mine. See for yourself."
The woman pointed out through the glass dome, and Garrow followed her direction. A piece of the void moved slowly across the prow of Endurance, passing between the bow of the warship and the distant glow of the Iotan sun. Whereas conventional vessels of the Imperial fleets ran with pennants and signal lamps to illuminate the lengths of their hulls, this new arrival, this Area Gloris, came in darkness, arriving out of the interstellar deeps as an ocean predator might slip to the surface of a nighttime sea. Garrow had never laid eyes on a black ship before. These were the mothercraft of the Silent Sisterhood, carrying them back and forth across the galactic disk on the Emperor's witch-hunting missions. It was hard to make out anything more than the most basic details of the ship's design. Framed against the solar glow of Iota Horologi, the battle-cruiser was at least a match in size for the Death Guard capital ship Indomitable Will. It lacked the traditional plough-blade prow of most Imperial vessels, ending instead in a blunt bow. A single knife-edged sail hung below the stern, and on it was an Aquila cut from shimmering volcanic glass. Where Endurance and the ships of the Astartes flotilla were swords against the enemies of Terra, Area Gloris was a hammer of witches. "Impressive," rumbled Garrow. There was little else he could say. He found himself wondering what it would be like to wander the decks of the vessel, at once attracted and repelled by the idea of what secrets the craft must hide. Sister Amandira bowed again and nodded to her novice. "We take our leave of you, honoured Captain," said the girl. "We are to make space for Luna by day's end, and the warp grows turbulent." "Safe journey, sisters," he offered, unable to tear his gaze from the dark starship. Caleb guided the cart across the length of the armory chamber, taking care to stay to the outer walkway around the edges of the long hall. His master's bolter lay across the trolley, the weapon's usually flawless finish marred by lines of damage from the engagement on the Yorgul world ship. As Garrow's housecarl, it was Caleb's duty to see the gun to the arming servitors and ensure that the weapon was returned to its full glory as quickly as possible. He intended not to disappoint his captain. He passed knots of Death Guard as they debriefed and disarmed, men from Temeter's company in animated conversation about a thorny moment during the boarding of a Xenos destroyer, and Astartes of Typhon's first in bellicose humour. Across the chamber he spied Haker, talking with Decius, as the younger man relayed a moment from the battle with an enthusiasm that the dour veteran clearly did not share. The men of the 14th Legion were not given to raucous celebration in their victories. Such displays, Caleb had heard it said, were more in the character of the Space Wolves or the World Eaters, but they did, in their own fashion, salute their successes and give honour to those who fell along the way. The Death Guard cultivated an image that other legions were only too quick to accept, that they were brutal, ruthless, and hard-hearted, but the reality had more shades to it than that. That these Astartes rarely made sport of their warfare was true, but they were not so bleak and stern as some would have believed. Compared to the stories Caleb had heard of stoic and dispassionate legions like the Ultramarines or the Imperial Fists, the Death Guard could almost be considered willful and disorderly. Rounding a stanchion, the housecarl's train of thought stalled at the sound of harsh laughter from a figure before him. He hesitated. Commander Grulgor stood in his path, speaking in muted, amused tones to an Astartes from his second company. The two men clasped gauntlets in a firm, serious handshake, and, in spite of the dimness of the ill-lit walkway, Caleb was still able to make out the shape of a disc-shaped brass token held in Grulgor's fingers before he passed it into the other man's grip. He understood immediately that he had intruded on a private moment, something only Astartes should share, something that a mere serf like him was not to be privy to. But there was nowhere Caleb could hide, and if he turned around, the clatter of the cart's wheels would reveal him. In spite of himself, he coughed. It was a very small sound, but it brought with it a sudden silence as the commander broke off and noticed the housecarl for the first time. Caleb was looking directly at the decking, and did not see the expression of complete contempt Grulgor turned upon him.
"Garrow's little helot," said the commander. "Are you listening where you should not?"
He took a step towards the housecarl, and against his will Caleb shrank back. Grulgor's voice took on the tone of a teacher lecturing a student, making a lesson of him.
"Do you know what this is, Brother Mokir?"
The other Astartes examined Caleb coldly.
"It's not a servitor, Commander, not enough steel and pistons for that. It resembles a man."
Grulgor shook his head.
"No, not a man, but a housecarl."
The emphasis he put on the title was scornful.
"A sad bit of trivia, a dusty practice from the ancient days."
The commander spread his hands.
"Look on, Mokir. Look at a failure."
Caleb found his voice.
"Lord, if it pleases you, I have duties to perform."
He was ignored.
"Before our Primarch brought new, strong blood to our legion, there were many rituals and habits that knotted around the Astartes. Most have been cut away."
Grulgor's face soured.
"Some still remain, thanks to the dogged adherence of men who should know better."
Mokir nodded. "Captain Garrow."
"Yes, Garrow."
Grulgor was dismissive.
"He allows sentiment to cloud his judgment. Oh, he's a fine warrior, I will give him that, but our brother Nathaniel is old in his ways, too bound by his Terran roots."
The Astartes leaned closer to Caleb, his voice dropping.
"Oh, Am I incorrect in my judgment? Perhaps Garrow keeps you around him, not out of some misplaced sense of tradition, but as a reminder, a living example of what it means to fail the Legion.
Please, said the serf, his knuckles white around the handles of the cart.
I do not understand,
said Mokir, genuinely confounded. How is this helot a failure?
Ha!
Grulgor said, looking away.
But for a turn of fate, this wastrel might have walked among the Legiones Astartes. He could have stood where you do now, brother, wearing the white, bearing arms for the Imperium. Our friend here was once an aspirant to the 14th Legion, as were we all. Only he fell short of greatness during the trials of acceptance, damned by his own weakness.
The commander tapped his chin thoughtfully.
Tell me, serf, where did your will break? Crossing the Black Plains? Was it in the Tunnel of the Venoms?
Caleb's voice was a whisper.
The Thorn Garden, Lord.
The hateful old memory emerged, fresh and undimmed despite the span of years since the event. The housecarl winced as he recalled the stabbing, poisonous barbs on his bare skin, his blood running in streaks all across his body. He remembered the pain, and worse, the shame, as his legs turned to water beneath him. He remembered falling into the thick, drab mud, lying there, weeping, knowing that he had lost forever the chance to become a Death Guard.
The Thorn Garden, of course.
Grulgor tapped his fingers on his vambrace.
So many have bled out their last in that ordeal. You did well to survive that far.
Mokir raised an eyebrow.
Sir, do you mean to say that this man was an aspirant? But those who fail the trials perish. Most do, corrected the commander. Most of them die of the wounds they suffer or the poisons they cannot resist during the 7 days of trial. But there are some few who fail but live on still, and even they will largely choose the Emperor's peace over a return in dishonor to their clans.
He gave Caleb a cool stare.
But not all. Some lack the strength of will even for that honor.
Grulgor looked back at Mokir and sniffed archly.
Some legions make use of their throwbacks, but it is not the Death Guard way. Still, Garrow chose to invoke an aged right to save this wretch from the pit of his own inadequacy. He rescued him.
Grulgor snorted.
How noble!
Caleb found a spark of defiance. "It is my privilege to serve," he said.
"Is it?" growled the Astartes. "You dare to parade your own deficiencies around us, the chosen men of Mortarion? You are an insult. You ape us, hang upon the tails of our cloaks while we fight for the future of our species, polishing guns and pretending you are worthy to be in our company."
He pressed Caleb's cart towards the wall.
"You skulk in the shadows. You are Garrow's petty spy. You are nothing."
Grulgor's annoyance flared in his eyes.
"If I were captain of the First, the pointless ritual that granted your existence would be ended in a second."
"So then," said another voice, "is the commander of the Second dissatisfied with his honoured role?"
Apothecary Voyen.
Grulgor greeted the new arrival with a wary nod.
"Sadly, there are many things that I find myself dissatisfied with."
He stepped away from the trembling housecarl. "Life is always a challenge in that regard," Voyen said with forced lightness, throwing Caleb a sideways look.
"Indeed," said the commander. "Is there something you wanted, brother?"
Only an explanation as to why you saw fit to waylay my captain's equerry during the course of his duties. The battle captain will be returning shortly, and he will wish to know why his orders have not been carried out. Caleb clearly saw a nerve twitch in Grolgor's jaw in reaction to the temerity of Voyen's reply, and for a moment he expected the senior Astartes to bark out an angry retort to the junior apothecary. But then the instant was gone, as some moment of understanding he was not a party to passed between them. With exaggerated care, Grolgor stepped out of Caleb's path.
"The helot may go about his business," he said.
And with that the commander dismissed them both and strode away with Mokir at his side. Caleb watched them go, and once again saw the glitter of the strange brass token as the Astartes tucked the coin-like object into an ammunition pouch on his belt. He sucked in a shaky breath and bowed to Voyen.
Thank you, Lord. I must confess I do not understand why the commander detests me so.
Voyen walked with him as the housecarl continued on his way.
"Ignatius Grolgor hates everything with equal measure, Caleb. You shouldn't take it personally."
And yet, the things he says, sometimes those thoughts are mine as well.
"Really? Answer me this, then. Do you think that Captain Garrow, the leader of the 7th Great Company, considers you an insult? Would a man of honor like him even contemplate such a thing?"
Caleb shook his head. Voyen placed his huge hand on the housecarl's shoulder.
"You will never be one of us, that is true. But you still serve the Legion despite that."
But Grolgor was right, Caleb mumbled. At times I am a spy. I go about the ship, invisible in plain sight, and I see and hear. I keep my Lord Captain conversant with the mood of the Legion.
The apothecary's expression remained neutral.
"A good commander should always be well informed. This is not plotting and scheming of which we speak. It is merely the report of talk and temper. You should feel no conflict in this."
They arrived at the arsenal dais, where the armament servitors were waiting, and the housecarl presented them with the captain's bolter. Caleb felt a churn of tension coming loose inside him, the need to speak pressing on his lips. Voyen seemed to sense it too, and guided him to an isolated corner near a viewport.
It is more than that. I have seen things.
Caleb's words were hushed and secretive.
Sometimes in quarters of the ships, where the crewmen do not often venture. Hooded gatherings, Lord. Clandestine meetings of what can only be your battle brothers.
Voyen was very still.
"You speak of the lodges, yes?"
Caleb was taken aback to hear the apothecary talk openly to him of such things. The quiet orders of men inside the Legiones Astartes were not something that was common knowledge to the outside world, and certainly they were things that a man such as Caleb should not have been aware of.
I have heard that name whispered.
The housecarl rubbed his hands together. The palms were sweaty. Something in the back of his mind urged him to say no more, but he couldn't help himself. He wanted to get the words out, to be free of them.
Just now, I saw the commander give a medallion to Brother Mokir. I have seen one before among the personal effects of the late Sergeant Rafim, after his death at the Carinea Moons.
Caleb licked his lips.
A brass disc embossed with the skull and star of our Legion, Lord.
"And what do you think it is?"
A badge, sir? A token of membership for these surreptitious groupings?
The Astartes gave him a level, unmoving stare.
"You are afraid that these meetings might threaten the Death Guard's unity, is that it? That sedition may be at their core?"
How could they not?
Hissed Caleb.
Secrecy is the enemy of truth. Truth is what the Emperor and his warriors stand for. If men must gather in shadows...
He broke off, blinking. Voyen managed a small smile.
"Caleb, you respect Captain Garrow. We all comprehend the might of our Primarch.
Do you think such great men would stand idly by and let subversion take root in their midst?
The apothecary put his hand on the housecarl's shoulder again, and Caleb felt the smallest amount of pressure there. He became aware of the mass and strength of the warrior's ceramite glove, enveloping his flesh and bone.
What you have seen in sideways glances and overheard rumours is nothing that should concern you, and it is certainly not a matter with which to distract the battle captain. Trust me when I tell you this.
But, Caleb said, his throat becoming dry.
But how can you know that?
The smile faded from Voyan's lips.
I can't say.
In his informal robes, Nathaniel Garrow still cut an impressive figure, even among his own men who had yet to divest themselves of their battle armour. At the far end of the wide armoury chamber, in the section of the long iron hall that was the province of the 7th Company, he moved through the Astartes and spoke with each one, sharing a nod or a grin with those in good humour, sparing a solemn commiseration for those who had lost a close comrade in the engagement with the Yorgul. He singled out Decius for mild chastisement, where the younger Astartes sat at work on his power fist, cleaning the oversized gauntlet with a thick cloth.
"Our tactical approach at the Bottle World was not meant to be one of close combat, Solon," he noted. "You carry a bolter for good reason."
"If it pleases my captain, I have heard this lecture already today from Brother Sendek. He informed me at great length and in intricate detail of exactly how I had failed to adhere to the rules of engagement."
"I see."
Garrow took a seat on the bench next to Decius.
"And what was your response?"
The young warrior smiled. "I told him that we were both still alive, rules or no, and that victory is the only true measure of success."
"Indeed."
"Of course." Decius worked at the power fist with great care. "What matters in war, above all other things, is the final result. If there is no victory—" He broke off, finding his words. "Then there is no point." From nearby, Andus Haker rubbed a hand over his stubbly grey chin.
"Such tactical genius from the mouth of a whelp. I fear I may become giddy with surprise."
Decius's eyes flashed at the old veteran's jibe, but Garrow caught the moment and laughed softly, diffusing it.
"You must forgive Andus, Solon. At his age, his sharp tongue is the only blade he can wield with skill any more."
Haker clutched at his chest in mock pain.
"Oh, an arrow to my heart from my own captain. Such tragedy."
Garrow maintained an even smile, but in truth he could detect the weariness, the pain in his old friend's forced jocularity. Haker had lost men from his squad on the world ship, and the pain of it was just below the surface.
"We all fought well this day," said the captain,
the words coming of their own accord.
"Once more the Death Guard have been the tools that carved the Emperor's will into the galaxy."
None of the other Astartes spoke. Each of them had fallen silent, faces turned over Garrow's shoulder. As he cast around to learn why, as one, the men of the 7th Company came to their knees.
"My battle captain."
It perturbed Garrow to realize that he had not even heard the approach of his Primarch. As in the assembly hall before the assault, Mortarion made issue of his presence only when it suited him to do so. Garrow bowed low to the master of the Death Guard, dimly aware of Typhon at his lord's side, and a servitor lurking behind the first captain's cloak.
"My lord,"
he replied. Mortarion's face shifted in a cool smile, visible even behind the breath collar around his throat and lips.
"The Sisterhood has taken leave of us. They spoke highly of the 7th.
Garrow dared to raise his gaze a little. Like him, the Primarch was no longer clad in his brass and steel power armour, but instead in common duty robes over a set of more utilitarian gear. Still, even in such simple garb there was no mistaking his presence. High and gaunt, a man spun from whipcord steel muscle, He was as tall in his deck boots as Typhon was in the First Company's Terminator armour. And, of course, there was the Man-Reaper. Sheathed across his back, the arc of the heavy black blade curved behind his head in a lightless sweep.
"Stand, Nathaniel, please. It becomes tiresome to look down upon my men."
Garrow drew himself up to his full height, looking into the Primarch's deep amber eyes and steeling himself not to draw back. In turn, Mortarian's gaze burned deep into him, and the captain felt as if his heart were held in the Primarch's long, slender fingers, being weighed and considered.
"You ought to watch your step, Typhon," said the Death Lord. "This one, he'll have your job one day."
Typhon, ever sullen, only grimaced. Before the first captain, the Primarch, and at the edges of his sight, the twin guards of the Death Shroud, Garrow felt as if he was at the bottom of a well. The nerve of a common man would probably have broken beneath such scrutiny.
"Lord," he asked, "what service may the 7th Company do for you?"
Mortarian beckoned him.
"Their captain may step forward, Garrow. He has earned a reward."
Nathaniel did as he was told, darting a quick look towards Haker. His words at the lakeside echoed in his mind. "We don't seek accolades and honours." Garrow had no doubt that the veteran was keenly amused by this turn of events.
"Sir," he began, "I deserve no special—" "That is not a refusal forming upon your lips, is it, Captain?" warned Typhon. "Such false modesty is unwelcome."
"I am merely a servant of the Emperor," Garrow managed.
"That is honour enough."
Mortarian gestured the servitor forward, and the captain saw that it carried a tray of goblets and bowls.
"Then instead, Nathaniel, might you honour me by sharing my drink?"
He stiffened, recognizing the ornate cups and the liquid in them.
Of course, Lord."
It was said that there was no toxin too strong, no poison so powerful, and no contagion of such lethality that a Death Guard could not resist it. From their inception, the 14th Legion had always been the Emperor's warriors in the most hostile of environments, fighting through chem clouds or acidic atmospheres that no normal human could survive in. Barbarous, the Legion's base, the adoptive home planet of Mortarian himself, moulded this characteristic. As with their Primarch, so with his Astartes. The Death Guard were a resilient, invincible breed. They hardened themselves through stringent training regimens as neophyte Astartes, willingly exposing themselves to chemical agents, contaminants, mortal viral strains, and venoms of 1,000 different shades. They could resist them all. It was how they had found victory amid the blight fungus of Ursa, how they had weathered the hornet swarms on Ogre 4, the reason why they had been sent to fight the chlorine-breathing Yorgul. The servitor deftly mixed and poured dark liquids into the cups, and Garrow's nostrils sensed the odour of chemicals, a distillate of the agent's magenta nerve-bane, some variety of sword-beetle venom, and other less identifiable compounds. No Astartes in Mortarian service would ever have dared to call this practice a ritual. The word conjured up thoughts of primitive idolatry, anathema to the clean, impious logic of imperial truth. This was simply their way, a Death Guard tradition that survived, despite the intentions of men like Ignatius Grulgor. The cups were Mortarians, and in each battle where the Death Lord took the field in person, he would select a warrior in the aftermath and share with that man a draught of poison. They would drink, and they would live, cementing the unbreakable strength of the Legion they embodied. The servitor presented the tray to the Primarch, and he took a cup for himself, then handed one to Garrow and a third to Typhon. Mortarian raised his goblet in salute.
Against death.
With a smooth tip of his wrist, the Primarch drained the cup to its dregs. Typhon showed a feral half-smile and did the same, completing the toast and drinking deep. Garrow saw a flush of crimson on the first captain's face, but Typhon gave no other outward sign of distress. He sniffed at the liquid before him, and his senses resisted. His implanted neuroglottis and preomnor organs rebelling at the mere smell of the poisonous brew. But to refuse the cup would be seen as weakness, and Nathaniel Garrow would never allow himself to be accused of such a thing.
"Against death," he said.
With a steady motion, the captain drank it all, and placed the upturned goblet back on the tray. A ripple of approval drifted through the men of the 7th Company, but Garrow barely heard it. His blood was rumbling in his ears as punishing heat seared his throat and gullet, the powerful engines of his Astartes physiology racing to fight down the toxins he had ingested. Decius was watching him in awe, without doubt dreaming of a day when it might be his hand, not Garrow's, holding the goblet. Mortarian's chill smile grew wider.
"A rare and fine vintage, would you not agree?"
His chest on fire, Garrow couldn't speak, so he nodded. The Primarch laughed in a low chug of amusement. Mortarian's cup could have contained water for all the apparent effect it had upon him. He placed his hand on the battle captain's back.
"Come, Nathaniel. Let's walk it off."
As they came to the ramp that led to the balcony above the Grand Armory chamber, Typhon bowed to his liege lord and made his excuses, walking away towards the alcoves where Commander Grulgor and the 2nd Company made their station. Garrow cast back to see the death shroud following them in lockstep, moving with such flawless precision that they appeared to be automata and not actually men.
"Don't worry, Nathaniel," said Mortarian. "I have no plans to replace my guardians just yet. I'm not about to recruit you into the secret dead."
"As you wish, Lord," Garrow replied, getting the use of his throat back.
"I know you frown on such things as the cups, but you must understand that honors and citations are sometimes necessary."
He nodded to himself.
"Warriors must know that they are valued. Praise from one's peers must be given when the moment is right. Without it, even the most steadfast man will eventually feel unvalued."
There was an edge of melancholy that flickered through the Primarch's voice, so quickly that Garrow decided he had imagined it. Mortarian brought them to the edge of the balcony, and they looked down at the large assemblage of men. Although endurance was not large enough to hold the entire legion, many of the Death Guard's 7 companies were represented below, in whole or in part. Garrow caught sight of Ulis Temeter, and his comrade threw him a salute. Garrow nodded back.
"You are a respected man, Nathaniel," said the Primarch. "There's not a captain in the whole of the Legion who would not acknowledge your combat prowess."
He smiled slightly again.
"Even Commander Grulgor, although he may hate to admit it." "Thank you, Lord."
"And the men. The men trust you. They look to you for strength of character, for leadership, and you give it."
"I do only what the Emperor commands of me, sir."
Garrow shifted uncomfortably. As honoured as he was to have a private moment with his master, it troubled him in equal measure. This was not the direct, clear arena of warfare, where Garrow understood what was expected of him. He was in rarefied air here, loitering with a son of the Emperor himself. If Mortarian sensed this, he gave no sign.
"It is important to me to have unity of purpose within my legion,
just as it is important for my brother Horus to have unity across the entirety of the Astartes."
"The War Master," breathed Garrow.
There had been rumours aboard the Endurance for some time, that elements of the Death Guard's flotilla would be sent on a new task after the Yorgul interception. At the forefront of this talk was the possibility that they would join the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade, commanded by none other than the chosen son of the Emperor himself, Horus the War Master. It was clearly more than rumour, he now realized. Garrow had fought side by side with the warriors of Horus's 16th Legion in the past, and had only admiration for men like Malagurst, Garviel Loken, and Tarik Torgadon.
I have served with the Lunar Wolves in the past, Lord.
They are the sons of Horus now, Mortarion corrected gently. Just as the Death Guard were once the Dusk Raiders.
My brother expects great things of our Legion, Captain. A battle is coming that will test all of us, from the War Master to your lowly housecarl.
I will be ready. The Primarch nodded.
I have no doubt of that.
But it is not enough to be ready, Nathaniel. His fingers knitted together over the iron balustrade. The Death Guard must be of one mind. We must have singular purpose, or we will falter. Garrow's discomfort deepened, and he wondered if the after-effects of the cup's contents were not still upon him.
I'm not sure I understand you, Lord.